Racism in the Republican Party. How much of a problem is it really? Is it prevalent? Is it a problem that is relegated to the rank and file, or does the party leadership purposefully exploit racist sentiment for political gain? In the minutes that follow, we will explore these and other questions and what can and should be done about it.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota.
The year was 1990. The senator, Jesse Helms. His opponent, a one-time mayor of Charlotte, an African-American candidate named Harvey Gantt. In the closing weeks of the hard-fought campaign, poll numbers showed Gantt enjoying a slight lead over Helms. This is when Helms and his campaign staff hatched one of the most controversial advertisements in recent political history, a spot that has come to be known simply as Jesse Helms' White Hands ad.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? Harvey Gantt says it is. Gantt supports Ted Kennedy's racial quota law that makes the color of your skin more important than your qualifications. You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
To understand the modern Republican Party's appeal to racism as a political strategy, it is necessary to first examine the intersection of race in politics and its development throughout American history. When the nation gained its independence from England in 1776, many of the newly independent colonies already depended on slave labor for much of their economic output. And so it was that a Declaration of Independence that had enshrined the notion that all men were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including among them liberty, was ignored on that point. And when it came time for the new nation to draft its constitution, black slaves were counted as only 3/5 of a person for purposes of political representation. Ironically, since blacks could not vote, even this 3/5 political power was exercised by their white slave masters. The Civil War put an end to slavery, and eventually also put an end to the disenfranchisement of African Americans from the nation's political process. In fact, the immediate aftermath of the war saw hundreds of black politicians rise to state and national offices throughout the South. But a white backlash soon ensued, which saw the rise of terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and a reactionary Southern Democratic Party determined to strip the emancipated slaves of their newfound political freedoms. For nearly 100 years, the American South was a firmly Democratic region, as racist Democrat and Dixiecrat politicians presented a united front against true political, economic, and social equality for African Americans. But the South's political allegiance to the Democratic Party would soon come to an end. In 1964, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act, which demanded racial integration and prohibited the disenfranchisement of African American voters through Jim Crow laws and other forms of political exclusion. Johnson predicted at the time that the Democratic Party had lost the South for a generation.
Reaches into every section and state of America. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
But the South did not turn thanks to the actions of Democrats alone. The Republican Party, which under Lincoln had fought the Civil War and freed the slaves, seized the opportunity that had been presented by Johnson's courageous stand for civil rights. In the run-up to the presidential elections of 1968, Richard Nixon and his political advisors coined the so-called Southern strategy, which sought to entice Southern voters into electing Republicans by appealing to still widespread racist sentiment in the region.
When the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented lawlessness, when a nation has been known for a century for equality of opportunity is torn by unprecedented racial violence, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America.
The racial policies of the Democratic and Republican parties had now undergone a complete reversal since the Civil War era, and many conservative Southern Democratic politicians, such as Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat candidate for president in 1948, officially switched parties and became full-fledged Republicans. Following Nixon's victory over Hubert Humphrey in 1968, every successful Republican presidential candidate has embraced a Southern strategy to a lesser or greater extent. In 1980, candidate Ronald Reagan launched his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where a decade and a half before, 3 civil rights workers had been brutally murdered. In Mississippi, Reagan proclaimed himself a supporter of states' rights, a code word for opposition to integration and the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 70s. Years earlier, Reagan had been a fairly progressive governor of California as pertained to matters of race. His reversal on that account coincided with his political success on a national level, and in the 2 terms that followed, Reagan would reward his Southern supporters with his opposition to civil rights legislation, affirmative action programs, a Martin Luther King holiday, economic sanctions for apartheid South Africa, and a host of other issues seen as advancing the causes and concerns of black Americans. Ronald Reagan's successor in the White House was his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush. While not generally considered as much of an ideological firebrand as his predecessor, Bush's tenure was marked by one of the most notorious exploitations of racial animus to be seen in a presidential contest. Running a tight race against Democratic challenger Michael Dukakis, Bush turned to political advisor Lee Atwater for assistance. Republican Party officials then funded and ran a campaign ad attacking a long-standing Massachusetts prison furlough program. The advertisement was designed to stoke white fear of African-American males and featured a prominent shot of Willie Horton, a black prisoner who had raped a woman while on furlough. Vice President Bush won the 1988 presidential elections and became president in no small part thanks to Atwater and the Willie Horton ad. As a postscript, years later, while he was dying of brain cancer, Lee Atwater sent written apologies to many of the people he felt he had wronged throughout his political career. Among the recipients of a letter of apology from Atwater was Michael Dukakis. When he set out to challenge Vice President Albert Gore for the presidency in 2000, candidate George W. Bush announced himself as a different kind of Republican, a compassionate conservative who would work with opposition politicians to bring a new sense of collegiality to Washington. But before he could face Gore, Bush first had to dispense with his principal rival for the Republican primary, Arizona Senator John McCain. Early in the race, it seemed as if McCain had the upper hand, having defeated Bush at the important New Hampshire primary. But Bush struck back in South Carolina, where his supporters stopped racist rumors that McCain had fathered a black child, and where Bush kicked off his campaign appearances with a speech at Bob Jones University.
2 weeks ago is still generating controversy. The school prohibits interracial dating, and officials there have called Catholicism a cult.
Later, candidate Bush would offer an apology to Catholics for speaking at Bob Jones, but no apology was ever offered to African Americans.